I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the 133rd meeting of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. We are continuing our study on challenges that we are facing with respect to migration, as well as those opportunities for the 21st century. And within that larger study, we are focusing several meetings on the two global compacts that are currently under international discussion, the Global Compact on Refugees and on Migration. That's the focus of this meeting. We have two panels today. And the first panel, we have one witness in person. Thank you very much for coming. And two by video conference. I think we'll start with the furthest away and then move to the closer witness on video conference. And then we'll close this first panel with the witness from ACT Alliance. Okay, so each witness has 7 minutes. And we're going to begin with Ms. Michelle Klein-Solomon from the IOM, coming to us from Geneva, Switzerland. Bienvenue, merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present in front of the committee today. Very much welcome your inquiry into these questions, and I am delighted on behalf of the International Organization for Migration to have an opportunity for both a presentation and a discussion with you. As the chairman said, I will be introducing the subject of the Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. That compact is the result of member state negotiations in the General Assembly of the United Nations taking place over the course of the last year and a half, and it will be presented for adoption by member states at the highest level of state and governments on the 10th of December in Marrakesh, Morocco. The Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration is very much designed to enhance both the safety and the security of migration, and to reduce both the incidence and the impacts of irregular migration. It is the first intergovernmentally negotiated comprehensive agreement on migration. Importantly, it is not legally binding. It is designed to be a cooperation framework between states to work together to more effectively manage what is one of the challenges of our time, not only, of course, in Canada and North America, but in all other parts of the world, is how to ensure that the movement of people today is more safe, more orderly, more predictable, and that we work together to reduce both the abuses that take place and the risks both to individuals and communities associated with unsafe and irregular migration. So the key aspects of this cooperation framework are, first of all, again, that it is not legally binding. It fully respects the sovereignty of national governments to make their own determinations about national migration policy, including with respect to the question of which non-nationals to admit into their territories. At the same time, it recognizes that no state acting on its own can effectively address migration, that by its very nature, migration is a transnational phenomenon, and this compact is designed to set out a cooperation framework whereby states can work more effectively together. It does so through the articulation of some common principles, as well as articulating 23 objectives. They're broad objectives at addressing all aspects of migration, from the factors that drive migration to the conditions of migration, the need to put in place mechanisms for safe migration, for example, legal labor migration opportunities, opportunities for family migration, for student visas, things of that sort, while in no way dictating any quotas or any particular requirements on any government, and also looks to address questions like the phenomenon of smuggling and trafficking and better law enforcement cooperation, as well as cooperation on return and reintegration of migrants who are no longer authorized to stay. Those are just some examples of the types of objectives that are contained in the compact. As I indicated, there are 23 of them. They set out broad objectives, and then under each is a set of best practices or examples of actions that could be taken to realize those objectives. It will be up to each government to decide which of the objectives to pursue and which actions to pursue them, and in what order. So it is very much a discretionary framework, but intended to create a sense of a shared solidarity and a commitment to make the migration process work more effectively. My final point is that, of course, more effectively managing migration is not just about governments. And while it's, of course, primarily member states who have the responsibilities to manage migration, not only within their territories, but in terms of their cooperation, they will need to do so with a range of other stakeholders, of course, employers who have a very real role to play in the migration process, recruiters of migrants, migrant and diaspora communities themselves, international organizations to the extent that that is helpful, and of course local governments, because so much of migration is experienced and determined by policies and processes at the local level. Mayors, local government officials will be essential. So let me conclude my opening remarks by saying that this framework that was very much called for, developed by governments, member states throughout the entire United Nations, is of course now very much in the media in some countries. There have been questions raised in some societies about whether this is a good idea and the extent to which it might infringe on the sovereignty of states. Let me underscore for you that the compact makes absolutely explicit that it is both not legally binding and that it fully recognizes the sovereign jurisdiction and authority of governments to determine their own migration policies. What it intends to do is to actually create more effective policies by states working together, learning from one another, learning from each other's good practices, and working together to manage migration to better effect. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions that you may wish to pose.
Thank you very much. On continue avec Monsieur Stéphane.
We'll continue with Mr. Stéphane Vinas, coordinator with Caritas Canada, Development and Peace. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of this committee. My name is Stéphane Dias, coordinator of emergencies for Caritas Canada. On behalf of my organization, our local partners, and the vulnerable populations we support in over 40 countries, I thank you for these consultations. For 50 years now, we've been the official solidarity organization of the Catholic Church of Canada. We have the support of over 13,000 members in Canada to help the poor in their fight for justice in their countries. Right now, we have an education aspect called Partager le chemin. We are inspired by the words of Pope Francis and our members. I think it's very important to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants and refugees, including Syrian refugees here in Canada, whom we've supported. We want to look at the profound root causes of forced migration. It is the message of these people that I bring to you today. Every minute, 31 people are forced to flee their country. That's double the population of Canada that is in a situation of forced migration, 68.5 million people. The majority of these people come from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Burma, and Somalia. where Caritas and Development and Peace has local partners. Beyond the figures and concepts, migrants and refugees are people like you and I who are seeking peace, as underscored by Pope Francis. They seek security and liberty for themselves and their families. They want to become actors in their own lives. These people took the decision to leave, but they didn't really have the choice. Nobody chooses to flee and put their lives and that of their children in danger. They do it by coercion or necessity or despair. These migrants are human beings with rights and dignity. How can we better help them? It was mentioned in the pacts. It's by attacking the root causes that force people to leave, preventing forced departures and facilitating the return that they hope for. Most migrants want to return when the conditions are favorable. You have this situation in Bangladesh, Rohingya who have fled commit suicide if forced to return. In Syria, there are still a risk of forced return, repression, and instability. If we want to make sure that returns are done in a voluntary and dignified and sustainable manner, we have to try to solve the root causes at the bottom of these human problems. This is underscored. The elimination of these root causes is the most effective way to come up with a solution. This is a result of faulty political, economic, and social development. It is important to recognize the causes, factors that are multiple and complex at the origin of these displacements. Armed conflict, persecution, economic and political causes, environmental causes, such as gas and oil exploration, exploitation of industries, and so on. The members of Development and Peace and Caritas Canada make the following recommendations. As artisans of peace, Canadians can support our leadership to implement the 2 pacts on refugees and migrants in keeping with the values of Canada on the international scene, to promote diplomatic solutions that are political and peaceful to armed conflicts, especially with the participation of women, reinforce, protect, and help the civil society that works for peace, democracy, defending human rights, and accountability of our leaders in fragile southern states. Forced migration will only increase if nothing is done. As a funder, Canada can lean on its financing reputation to ensure adequate support that's foreseeable, flexible, and multi-annual in order to alleviate poverty. It can be done through achieving the objective of the OECD, which is 0.7% of GDP for public aid to development. Could also fund initiatives to reduce the risk of catastrophe, prevention of conflicts, and promoting peace. In the international community, Canada can look to its values to ensure that local populations benefit from all the economic spin-offs due to them in order to avoid economic migrations. Beneficiaries of international aid should not be victimized by international politics or prejudicial regional politics. We also have to fight to reduce greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect in order to preserve our common home, the Earth. And to summarize, it's important to look at the vision of Pope Francis and that he talked about during the first World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2017. There should be no family without a home, no refugee who's unwelcome, no one without dignity, no injured people without medical care, no child without a childhood, no young man or woman without a future, and no elderly person without dignity due to its age. That is what we have to make sure of. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Now hear from Ms. Castra Mutoigo?
Yes.
Close?
Yes, you got it.
Very good.
Very well done.
From the ACT Alliance.
Okay,
Welcome.
Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for this time that I can share with you. My name, as you've noted, is Ida Castro Mutoigo. I work with the World Renew as an executive director in Canada, and that is an agency, just for your interest, that has been a sponsorship agreement holder for refugees for over 40 years. And I'm also a daughter of immigrant parents who left Holland from after the Second World War, and I married somebody who's an immigrant from Uganda and have a daughter who's an immigrant from Uganda. I am very much glad to speak on behalf of the Action by Churches Together, ACT Alliance, where I serve on the governing board and executive committee. ACT is an international alliance of about 150 churches and faith-based organizations, including World Renew, working together in over 125 countries. Why did ACT Alliance get involved in the Global Compact initiative? Global Alliance, like ACT, has a strategy that prioritizes using resources and sharing expertise to effectively address the issues of migration and displacement, especially as these impact human rights, poverty levels, and resilience to disasters. And that's why ACT Alliance Global Secretariat Office has been involved at every single stage of the process of developing the Global Compact. We have also consulted membership around the world, working with migrants and host communities. Why do we feel the Global Compact is important? By creating this agreement, as was mentioned, among UN member states, it enables migration to be more predictable and manageable, while also protecting the rights of vulnerable migrants from the point of their departure from one country to the arrival of another, including their resettlement. It addresses the root causes or drivers of the unsustainable migration that can be experienced. It increases the availability of protection for people suffering rights violations. It ensures better access to basic services. It prevents human trafficking and smuggling. It fosters collaborative relationships in its implementation. And as was noted very well by Stefan, as much as these global compacts address the flow of migrants, imperative that we also identify and address the current root causes of displacement, of conflict, ecological disasters, climate change, and poverty. Sponsorship and resettlement are important things to do in this crisis, but the deeper justice work of addressing these root causes is critical. So will the Global Compacts present a threat to the Government of Canada, especially in its ability to ensure rights and well-being of Canadians or to have sovereignty? No, because the Global Compacts have been an entirely state-led process. Civil society and other stakeholders have had a seat at the table. They were not the drivers behind it, and neither was the UN. And I think that's very important to note. The Global Compact on Migration also reaffirms the sovereign right of states in the paragraph 15C, so you can read that for further study. It will not be an international agreement nor a treaty and will have no legal effect on national legal systems, as was emphasized by Michelle. The Global Compact on Migration actually reinforces and clarifies what states have already committed themselves to do in other international treaties and laws, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Compact on Migration fosters more effective whole-of-government approaches to migration by encouraging states to model interdepartmental cooperation to achieve its objectives. And this supports something that Canada actually is quite good at and has been at the forefront of reinforcing a whole-of-society kind of approach. So will the Global Compact of Migration add a financial burden to the Government of Canada and its citizens? No, because there are multi-stakeholders that are already well-equipped, including civil society organizations like ours, who provide strong support services for new immigrants and refugees. It does not present a financial burden either when the Government of Canada continues to set its own requirements for approving and ensuring immigrants follow its assessments for economic viability. Canada has always been a country of migrants and multi-stakeholder support for refugees, and has encouraged the achievement of several key outstanding, I think, objectives. And government-sponsored refugees, for example, if you compare them to the general population of Canadians, you will find that they receive roughly about the same amount of welfare. Privately sponsored refugees do not receive any government support for over the 12-month sponsorship period. And over time, refugees have had the same levels of economic success as other Canadians in terms of household income and home ownership. And I just want to share a great example of this. A decade after arriving in Canada, Vietnamese refugees had a lower unemployment rate and relied on less social assistance than the Canadian average. 1 in 5 had started their own business. They are paying taxes, creating jobs, and making Canada better. And I have some documentation which I could share later with your staff. What are the potential costs for Canada not supporting the Global Compact on Migration? It's worth noting that the isolated and vastly different approaches of governments to migrants can potentially cause harm to their neighboring states. So while some states might opt out of the global compacts for reasons they cite as threats to sovereignty, peace, order, and good governance, their lack of coordinated efforts with neighboring states around migration is likely to lead to increased incidences of disorder, protests, and distressed migrants. Another cost is a lost opportunity for Canada to do longer-term projections of labor needs and then have planned migrations for meeting these needs. Canada's economic health depends on this predictability for permanent and temporary migration. And another loss by not joining this global compact is Canada's international reputation in leading the dialogue around such issues of shared concern, like international migration and human rights, as well as addressing these concerns in a healthy balance with national interests. Finally, it's worth mentioning here that our immigration pointing system provides important contributions to our social and economic fabric. However, in a crisis of displacement that we're experiencing in the world today that is probably deepening, we have a commitment to humanitarian and compassionate settlement as a critical role for Canada. We love to be self-congratulatory about refugee resettlement and sponsorship, but if we look at the statistics, it gives us pause to check whether our collective self-image is really accurate. Our statistics of settlement for those forced to flee are markedly lower than our welcome of voluntary migrants, who often are highly skilled and wealthy. So is there a better balance, particularly in the current displacement crisis of 68 million people around the world? That is our sincere hope as charities and faith communities, as ACT Alliance, that work on the front lines, that hear people's pain-filled and traumatic experiences. I pray God may have mercy and inspire the generous spirit of Canadians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all three of you, for your time today and for your expertise and your passion. I'm taken into many meetings I've had with CRC and organizations like that in my previous life, and my shoulders kind of drop and I relax. It's kind of easier for me to do that. We're going to begin our round of questioning with Ms. Zahid.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for your important input today. My first question is to all of you, and it is on the issue which has been touched briefly in your opening remarks by Ms. Klein and Ms. Castra Mutago. Sorry if I pronounce wrong. All of you are very familiar with the Global Compact on Migration. So if each one of you can comment on one of the common criticism leveled by the critiques, that it infringes on the national sovereignty of the country. Could each one of you briefly tell us if there is any evidence, whatever, so this non-binding statement of principles would infringe on national security. So maybe we can start with Ms. Klein. National sovereignty.
With pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Zahid, for the very direct question. The compact is explicit that it is non-legally binding and explicit that one of the guiding principles throughout its operation, as was said by my colleague Ida from ACT Alliance, that it takes full account of the sovereignty of states to determine their own national migration policies. That is recognized in paragraph 15 as one of the guiding principles. If you don't mind, I will read that to you because that statement is as clear as it can be. The Global Compact reaffirms the sovereign right of states to determine their national migration policy and their prerogative to govern migration within their jurisdiction in conformity with international law. Within their sovereign jurisdiction, states may distinguish between regular and irregular migration status, including as they determine their legislative and policy measures for the implementation of the Global Compact, taking into account different national realities, policies, priorities, and requirements for entry, residence, and work in accordance with international law. That, Madam, is the clearest statement about the recognition of the role of national sovereignty in national decision-making, but that concept is also picked up explicitly in many other parts of the compact. My last statement about that is, contrary to some press reports, there is absolutely no obligation in this agreement to take anyone into a country without the explicit authorization of national authorities. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. If we can go to Mr. Stefan.
If the other two want to comment on it, you may, or you can pass, whichever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Je pourrais faire une citation du pape François, tout simplement.
Facing the situation, we must always adapt ourselves to respecting security and the dignity of all. Whoever sees the interests of its own country by taking that into account that of other countries in an interconnected world. So I just wanted to answer by quoting Pope Francis.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Can we proceed to the second question? If Ms. Ida, you can respond to it. Germany has been a leader on the issue of migration. And just yesterday, speaking about the Global Compact on migration in the Parliament, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the following regarding the opponents of the Compact. There are people who say they can solve everything themselves and don't have to think about anyone else. That is nationalism in its purest form. So would you agree with Chancellor Merkel? And could you discuss why working together cooperatively is the only way we can hope to tackle the global migration challenge which we are facing right now?
Yeah, yes, I would agree. And I think I tried to highlight that in my statements as well, that the decision that some countries make that they think they can do in isolation actually affects others around them. And so this is the unfortunate result of highly nationalistic leaders. And this kind of compact is going to enable people to have discussions. If everybody signs on to it and commits to it, we can finally have conversations about promising practices that will ensure better migration and safety between our borders, and probably reduce the number of distressed people as a result. So yes, I would agree with her.
My next question would be, any one of you can answer it, would the ratification of the two global compacts by Canada necessitate or require any change in Canada's current policies or practices in regards to the immigration and refugees? Would that require any changes?
Are you asking you want to go in circle
Yeah,
again?
maybe you can start.
Okay. I would say that what it will do is it will challenge us to review what we currently have in place and how helpful or harmful some of the policies are. For example, one of the things that we have advocated for is the forgiveness of loans that refugees are asked to pay. And you can imagine people coming with hardly anything into the country, having to do this, take out a loan, and then having to pay back over the course of the first year or two. I can't imagine what that must be like. And that, to me, deserves a review. So there's things like that, which, you know, when you look at strengthening the ability of people to resettle or settle into their new countries, getting the support services that are needed, I think that those are things that we can examine and say, you know, can we do a better job? I think we can. I think Canadians can re-examine what they're doing, yes.
Ms. Klein, would you like to add to it?
Very briefly.
Yes, thank you very much. Technically, neither of the two global compacts would be ratified in the sense of requiring a legislative act, or because they're not international treaties. But in terms of the degree to which Canada already lives up to the commitments, the aspirations, the goals of these compacts, Canada is very well situated to actually not only implement what is aspired to in these global compacts, but also learn from them. And I'll speak only with respect to the Global Compact for Migration. As I said, there are 23 objectives, and under each of those, there's a listing of 10 to 15 effective practices that have been gleaned from experience around the world, including Canada's experience. Those may provide a source of rich ideas that would warrant reflection, but not require a change. So that, as
I'm afraid I need to end you there, but thank you very much.
No problem.
Ms. Rempel.
So I'm a bit confused because I've heard that the agreement from you is not binding, but then I've heard that if it wasn't ratified by everyone, then activities couldn't be coordinated. And then I just heard that Canada would be required to reflect upon or implement principles where there isn't principles. I mean, there was one policy change here suggested with loan forgiveness. So I guess my question is, if it's not binding, but Canada would be required to make changes, does this mean that the UN would basically assign rapporteurs to kind of disparage Canada or question its sovereign policies if it wasn't in alignment with the Global Compact if signed in the future?
Would you like me to address that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. No, there is no requirement for Canada to make any changes as a result of the Global Compact on Migration. None.
But
there's no requirement.
fair enough, but you just said that there would be areas that you would like to see change based on the agreement. And there are certain principles that Canada doesn't implement right now. So would the United Nations then perhaps, we often have rapporteurs write reports about Canadian policy. Would that be something that you would envision happening? UN pressure on Canada to change policy in the future if it wasn't in alignment per the definition of the UN on this?
I'll speak only to the Global Compact for Migration, not the Global Compact for Refugees. But in the migration context, the expectation is that there will be a review forum once every 4 years, but that will be determined by the member states what kind of review. So it would be.
So the review forum would then, so Canada's policies would then be subject to review and scrutiny and
the
typical UN rapporteur process that we all know and love.
No, it's not a rapporteur process at all. It's not a, there's no new special rapporteur that's foreseen with respect to this compact. And in fact, for right now, there is a special, not a rapporteur, but a special representative of the Secretary General for International
So
Migration.
if it's not
And-
binding and
Yeah.
there's no requirement to implement it by anybody at all, and there's really no process, you're saying the UN wouldn't push anyone to do it, then why did we spend a lot of money doing it?
Well, I was going to say to you that the review process is meant to be completely voluntary by states deciding what they would like to share with each other in terms of practices and learn from one another and identifying what works
So
and what doesn't work.
So I've sat
it's
here
not-
with the UNHCR, and I've asked for reviews on selections of IDP and how Yazidis weren't referred to Canada as part of the Syrian Refugee Initiative, and I've said, no, we don't need any change. It's fine, everything's great. But yet the UN has spent a lot of time and ostensibly money putting together an agreement that you say doesn't really require anyone to do anything.
The decision that these compacts are non-binding were decisions taken by member states. They set in September of 2016 in the New York Declaration of Refugees and Migrants, which was taken by the General Assembly, all member states of the UN said that they wanted to create non-legally binding compacts.
Okay.
So that was a member state
Well, I'll
decision.
ask one question. So in the compact, it says that member states should educate media professionals on migration-related issues and terminology and invest in reporting standards. What would those standards be?
That will be up to each country and
Well, what
its
would you say?
media. About reporting standards, media standards, fair and accurate reporting.
Well, what does that
fair
mean?
and accurate.
Like in the
Facts.
UN's bailiwick, what would that look like? Like if we were reviewing it, what would be a big checkbox on that?
Actual statistics, data, tracking of trends.
But terminology,
tracking of labor
like terminology, I'm just wondering what would be like check and X on the box.
No, I think every context is different. Each state has a different definition. Each state has different set of reporting and statistical databases. So it's. I mean, there is an international
So
definition.
some
of a
countries would
refugee.
be able to report on some stuff, and other countries would not be able to report on stuff.
It will be up to each country to decide how it reports. But that provision that you are talking about is designed to encourage more evidence-based discourse and evidence-based
What's the lack in
policy.
discourse right now?
Oftentimes there are assumptions or myths about migration or about
like what?
refugees.
Like what?
Typical ones are
Can we have the
that
witness have at least maybe a minute or more to answer
It is
the
my client.
questions? It's only she's only having maybe 10 seconds, 11 seconds at max to answer something. You cannot give a clear and concise answer in 11 seconds.
It is my time, Mr. Chair, and I only have a minute left, I believe.
It is your time, but I would just remind the member that if the witness has answered a question, she has a right to not answer it again if she's being asked several times for the same question. She has the right to answer
I
her
am
question.
asking a question. I mean, the global, just on this point of order, the compact and a lot of the criticism of it is suggesting that there would be some sort of reporting standard or terminology. And myself and my colleague, who's the immigration minister in Ontario, have been called many names by the Prime Minister and our immigration minister for raising the fact that we don't believe that people are fleeing persecution from upstate New York, for example. So I'm just wondering if the witness here, maybe I'll be more direct. Would you suggest that me coming out and saying, calling somebody who is illegally crossing the border from the United States into Canada an illegal border crosser under the Global Compact for Migration, would that be an incorrect terminology that the Global Compact would seek to correct?
No, somebody who crosses without authorization, crosses without authorization.
So is illegal border crosser a correct terminology under the Global Compact for Migration?
There's nothing that prohibits that terminology. Normally, what the UN would say, but it's not a requirement it's not a censorship. What the UN would normally say is someone crosses irregularly, but it is possible to use illegal as well. But we prefer the term irregular, but we're not going to sanction
So if it
anybody
was
for using the term illegal.
Under the Global Compact, if Canada was reviewed for this, like, how would that be treated? Like, would journalists
I'm
be
sorry,
said-
your time is over. Ms. Kwan, your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I thank all the witnesses for their presentation. It's interesting, you know, as we embark on this discussion, some people insist to say that asylum seekers are crossing over illegally, when here in Canada, our laws, the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, explicitly say that those who are crossing over irregularly are not committing a criminal offense. So with that being said, I guess my question is this, because there are some people, and I'll be very blunt, the Conservatives in the House of Commons, I think it was this week, asked the Prime Minister to step away from the Global Compact. And so I would really like to hear from our witnesses, what are the implications of that for Canada if we were to do that? So we will start, I think, with the folks on the screen, if you don't mind, because Ms. Castra, I don't know how to say the last name, Mutoigo, has offered some of those thoughts already. So if we can start with the folks on the screen, I would appreciate that.
Stefan?
Oui,
Yes. I think that all the policies and the sovereignty considered as a wall will not work. It's not laws and sovereignty that will prevent people from traveling, and that is why, once again, I would insist on the work that must be done on the root causes for these displacements and movements. There are people that are coming to Canada, as you said so well, and they should benefit from all the possible protections to ensure their dignity as human beings.
Thank you.
Ms. Kwan?
I'll go to our second witness, and then I'll ask my follow-up question.
Thank you very much. You asked specifically what would be the implication for Canada of stepping away. I think there are three main implications. One, there would be a loss of cooperation that is desperately needed in trust to be able to address what is fundamentally a cross-national transborder phenomenon. And I don't mean just with your southern neighbor, but of course across the world. So the real risk is a loss of cooperation. Second would be a loss of Canada's international standing, and was said so well by our previous statements, the commitment historically of Canada to fair and just immigration and refugee policies, as well as a leader internationally. And then third, finally, would be the very specific needs that Canada will have in terms of addressing what is a reality of migration and will not go away whether or not Canada becomes a part of this framework. You will lose the ability to have tools that can help in working together to make this more effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anything else to add, Ms. Castro-Montoya?
For me, the biggest loss is our care and our generosity for people who suffer. And for me, that is the most depressing thing to think about.
Thank you. As we have noted, as our guests have noted, the situation globally and the need for cooperation, and hence the compact. In terms of direct action from Canada, aside from being part of the compact, what do you think it is that Canada can offer at the table? Is it leveraging more aid, for example? Some have said to us in our travels to Uganda that we need to make sure that we continue to accept resettlement numbers, even though we can't resettle everyone, but it is also a signal to everyone that we are part of the solution and that resettlement is a component of it, is not all of it, but is a component of it. And so to that end, I wonder if you have any specific recommendations for Canada to undertake beyond the compact in terms of direct action. And again, I'll just go through all of the speakers in the same order that answered the previous question.
Well, then I would start. Yes? Okay, well, Canada, despite its envied situation, is a country that in 2016 had 1.7% of displaced peoples. So given Canada's economic situation, there's a lot of margin for more. I think also for Canada, it could increase funding to countries in the south that get more migrants and refugees to allow the situation, the emergencies to be worked on and to develop their capacity to receive, ensure the protection and dignity of those individuals in the southern countries. If we don't help them in the transit countries, then ultimately perhaps they'll be coming to Canada.
Do you have a suggestion by way of a percentage or a number specifically?
En termes de?
In terms of percentage of what?
Resettlement numbers.
I do not have a figure. It's up to Canada to do its own financial analyses as well as of its capacity. But I think that Canada can do much more when we talk compared to Jordan and Lebanon that are receiving millions of individuals without having the financial capacity to do so. But once again, accepting refugees and migrants in Canada is not necessarily the ultimate solution. The best one is to ensure that people do not have to leave their homes. That's the most important.
Thank you.
It's very well said by Stefan. In many respects, the longer-term picture about migration, and I'm not talking about refugees here, but migration patterns, we need to look at what leads people to move, and oftentimes it's lack of opportunity at home. And with the commitment of Canada and other governments around the world to the longer-term sustainable development agenda, to reducing insecurity, conflict, and to fostering development, create conditions for people to live safe and dignified lives at home and not be in a context where they're forced to move, including the results of increasing environmental degradation exacerbated by climate change. So there are many things that can be done to improve conditions to limit the risks to individuals that do affect both migratory and refugee policies and practices. And Canada is in a position to help lead the way on that. Thank you.
I'm afraid I need to end there. Mr. Ayoub.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses for coming. It's a very interesting subject, particularly when we see the energy that's expended across the world to have an agreement that in some way ensures there is a platform. It doesn't bring people together, but it has a platform for discussion and finally influence on world migration to learn the causes and to respond to those causes. There are two realities in opposition if we look at this situation. Either you can ignore it and not take part in it, and to some extent there's a problem there. The best way to influence and participate in the reintegration, be it the return of refugees or to host refugees, is to help develop the plan itself. And that is what the Global Compact seems to do. Those who are reluctant to join in the plan will find all kinds of reasons not to belong to it, to be afraid, and to focus on themselves. There are two realities, opposing realities. So I would like to talk about the fact that the United States is not going to participate. Canada is an important neighbor to the United States. Canada wants to be a world leader, not in migration, but in the influence that we have in the positive role of having positive policies for receiving refugees, compassion, fairness. How can we convince, how can we ensure that Canadians are well informed and ensure all of the details so that no matter what happens, the government, the Trudeau government, can be a leader and agree to have compassion. We do have a long history of compassion in Canada. There is a conservative current, if you will, to be conservative in our way of action. And how can we convince our conservative friends that this is the right thing to do?
Alors, allez-y, Monsieur Stéphane.
Stéphane, if you wish to go ahead. I have no order in particular. I would say to you to come back to current events, despite all migratory policies, despite everything the U.S. is putting in place, despite the threats that have been made by the president, there are still migrant caravans being organized. So these are migrant communities that are deciding to join a caravan to go to the United States anyway. So I think even if you're an island, people would take a boat. So once again, all the walls that we will build will be useless. The idea is once again to ensure dignity of individuals. And as you said, Canada is a country that welcomes people. And if one day we were in a situation where people had to flee, well, they would be happy to have other countries to be open and generous towards us.
Madame Montiago.
I always look at this from the perspective of what are Canada's gifts. And for those that are probably more conservative, I would say look at our civil society and its enormous wealth that it has in welcoming people and how we can generate that spirit amongst Canadians. If I look at our own community, faith-based community of 200 plus churches, 75% of them want to support refugees. We don't even have enough spaces. By September, they're completely filled up. And they support people to get on their feet, to get jobs, to start businesses, and look at the economic development that that is going to contribute to. And to put barriers that limit the growth of Canada, this place that we have a huge amount of space. All you have to do is fly from one part of the country to another. And comparatively to the US, look at the resources that we have. It's just enormous. So to look at it from an asset-based point of view and to generate how we can multiply those assets, to me, that's the key. And that's what this whole compact will do, is to help think about how do we settle refugees really well.
Merci. Madame Solomon, you have something to say about that, or?
Yes, just very briefly, and thank you very much, sir, for your statement. It's quite compassionate and compelling. One of the main aspirations of the Global Compact for Migration is to enhance the rule of law and to ensure due process of law in migration policies around the world. Canada obviously is committed to that and has a real interest in ensuring that other countries do as well. That will be important for addressing the labor market needs in Canada. Some of your Western provinces, of course, have skills gaps in particular sectors that need to be filled, including by migrant workers, but also in terms of ensuring a reduction in irregular migration. So you have a lot to to give to the world.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you. I don't have much time left. Je veux m'assurer de.
I just want to make sure there are trade agreements being concluded around the world. We're happy to have these trade agreements in order to take part and influence once again and to ensure fairness. The elimination of the root causes and the return of refugees, this is something that Stéphane mentioned. So how can we ensure, with regard to the root causes, the countries that have people fleeing because of war and others?
Going to be able to let them answer it.
Fast.
Je m'excuse.
Vous aurez l'occasion d'y répondre peut-être
Je
plus tard.
m'excuse. Ms. Rampel.
The 22nd objective of the Compact on Migration is to, quote, establish mechanisms for the portability of social security entitlements and earned benefits. What does that mean? To Michelle.
Yes, that means, for example, that where someone, I'll give you an example in the Caribbean, where someone has worked in one country in the Caribbean for many years, contributed to their social security system, healthcare system, that when they return to their home country, that they will be able to take the value of that back through a state-to-state cooperation agreement.
Okay, so can you explain how you envision that working?
There are examples where that works already, and in some cases largely negotiated as a matter of bilateral agreements between countries. In some regions of the world, it's undertaken on a regional basis.
So it'd be like if somebody earned the right to healthcare in one country, they would, if they moved to a different country, they would have the same entitlement there, is what you're saying?
No, they would take whatever the value of their accumulated rights are.
Okay.
For example, pension. If you earned a pension, if you worked in the country for 10 years and you contributed to the pension system, you would be able to take with you when you return, if there's an agreement between the countries, the value of your pension returning back to your country of origin. So only what you have earned based on your own contributions.
Okay. And so in terms of the management of that agreement, would that be... I'm just trying to understand how this works, because I know there's a lot of questions about state contributions. So if you just had any other information on that, it's a little unclear.
Each state is, it's challenging. It's a complicated area because every country's national system is different. And so finding ways to work out portability between systems requires mechanisms to translate from one to the other. So this is something, as I mentioned, the Caribbean, for example, where people tend to move around the Caribbean and work in different countries at various points in their career, have worked out a system for actually allocating time earned in various systems and working to.
Like the end goal would be a global system for that.
I don't think a global system is realistic anytime in the near future.
But that's what the agreement aspires to.
No, not necessarily. It talks about bilateral as well as regional. I think personally, this is my own opinion, having seen it. It's not realistic to imagine a massive global system on this anytime.
Is there any content in the agreement around reform for how the UN selects refugees for referrals to host countries like Canada?
That's specifically in the competence of the High Commission for Refugees. I would ask you to pose that question to them.
So it's not in that agreement at all? Like there's no reform mechanisms for the UN built into this agreement?
The Global Compact for Refugees or the Global Compact for Migration?
Like there's no discussion about reform on UN process in there?
There's quite a bit of discussion.
But it's more focused on member state.
Yes, but in the Global Compact for Migration, there's also recognition of the UN Secretary General's decision to create a new coordination mechanism in the UN system on migration.
How would that work?
The Secretary General has decided to create what is called a network on migration that puts the International Organization for Migration as the coordinator and the secretariat to bring the different parts of the UN system together to work in a more effective way to support member states.
Could you table with committee some information on that particular requirement? That's news to me. That would be interesting to get more information on. I just have a few seconds left, so I'll ask one last question. Do you know how much money Canada dedicated to the development of the Global Compact on Migration?
I am not aware because it's your diplomatic mission in New York that negotiates, and it is simply the people who are posted at your mission there who will undertake those negotiations.
So in terms of additional staff or hosting meetings or that sort of stuff, is there
The meetings have
any sort of outline of budget on how much we've spent?
I am not aware of that. There have been, so far it's been undertaken within existing resources. There have been no extra budgetary consequences of the process leading to the Global Compact.
Thank you.
You need to end there. We just had Mr. Whalen, I see someone's trying to get your chair, so I'll give you 2 minutes and then we're going to end this hour.
Thank you all for coming. My question relates to root causes of migration. And when I look at the document that's prepared by the Vatican that we had a chance to take a look at from January about 20 principles to follow in developing the compacts, and I would look at the compact on migration itself, maybe focus on objective 2. You talk about minimize adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin, and yet there's no discussion in here of impunity, and it seems that state impunity is one of the leading drivers for mass exodus from various countries and the collapse of human rights in countries or just kleptocracies in developing countries. And I'm wondering, how do we see reinvigorating state institutions within source countries for migrants as a goal? Because I don't see that either explicitly in the document prepared by the Vatican or in the compact, but that must be considered to be the primary root cause.
If I might, sir, you're absolutely right, and I'd like to call your attention to Objective 2, Paragraph 18B, which actually in the final sentence does address questions of rule of law, good governance, access to justice, protection of rights, as well as creating and maintaining peaceful and inclusive societies with effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, which I believe goes directly to your point.
Wonderful. It's great to see it there. And with respect to the Vatican's document, Stéphane?
The one that I provided to you recently. With regard to the Vatican's document, I think that I said so earlier when I spoke. We have to work on the accountability of countries in the South. States also have responsibility, and we must support civil societies that are working to ensure fewer or less corruption, more accountability, more respect for human rights. Yes, when we talk about a country, we also talk about currents and different currents and forces, and we must support civil society to ensure more state accountability, which is also a cause of what's happening. Responsibility is not just the North. For the North, both are responsible for problems and solutions. Thank you all for showing us the importance of this issue with regard to the compact. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our witnesses. That was very helpful. I'm always impressed when you ask a question and someone says go to number 218B, as though they know what they're talking about. So it's really very, very helpful to our committee to have such expertise from all three of you. We're going to suspend for just a moment as we bring in our next panel. I'm going to call the meeting back to order. Thank you very much. And we're going to welcome our witnesses coming by video conference. Mr. Eli from, again, from Switzerland. I recognize it's very late for you, so thank you for joining us. Mr. Axworthy from Manitoba, thank you for joining us. And Mr. MacArthur Ms. Singh from CARE Canada present. So I think we're going to begin with Mr. Eli coming to us from the International Council of Voluntary Agencies from Geneva. And each of the witnesses have 7 minutes, and then we'll have some questions for you. So we'll begin with you. Thank you. En français ou en anglais?
In English. Okay. Well, I will start in French saying merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. It's a privilege for me to speak to the committee.
To answer questions in French, of course. So I work in Geneva in a global network of NGOs, as you said, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. And as such, I have followed the Global Compact process very closely, sitting at meetings and exchanging with NGOs, UNHCR, and member states quite extensively. So I will draw on this experience to present a few reflections on the Refugee Compact and on how it might be implemented. First of all, the origins of the Refugee Compact are found in the 2015 crisis, which highlighted major weaknesses in the refugee regime. Particularly, I would say two, the lack of clear guidelines to promote international cooperation in this field. And second, the disproportionate responsibility borne on by a few states, either as financial contributors or as hosting countries. So all this demonstrated our collective inability to provide predictable, equitable, and sustainable responses to refugee situations. In reaction, UN member states called for the development of a refugee compact and also asked UNHCR to implement the comprehensive refugee response framework known as the CRRF, which is now an integral part of the compact. The compact was developed in 2017 and 18 through an inclusive process gathering member states, but also, of course, UNHCR and other stakeholders, including NGOs. There is therefore, I think, collective ownership on this document. The heart of the process was a series of 6 formal consultations this year on the basis of draft texts. Each member state had opportunities to comment, flag red lines, and suggest changes in the draft during the process. I believe Canadian NGOs provided inputs, and Canada was actually very much involved in the process. From the start, for example, when Ambassador McCartney was chairing the UNHCR governing body, but later on as well through a variety of initiatives. So the compact, as you may know, is now scheduled for adoption at the General Assembly next month. And already last week, UN member states showed quite strong support for its objectives. So what is the compact? I think it can be seen as a blueprint to reinvigorate the refugee regime and implement more efficiently and predictably commitments that actually have already been made through the 1951 Convention and other legal instruments. So as such, I think the compact is a practical document rather than a normative one. It reaffirms existing obligations, such as the core principle of non-refoulement, and details arrangements that states and other actors can activate to enhance their responses. Among the main features of the compact, I would highlight the following 3. First of all, arrangements to broaden the base of support and expand responsibility sharing. This mainly through a global refugee forum conceptualized as a new form of regular pledging event, which will be multi-stakeholder, meaning that this is not just about state contributions, which will try to go beyond financial contributions, also calling for resettlement places to be pledged, technical assistance, and, for example, policy changes. The forum is also supposed to bring accountability through a follow-up process on the commitments made, and it is also supposed to showcase good practices, to be an occasion for that. The second main feature, I think, is that the compact further advances the global shift away from the camp approach to promote refugees' self-reliance and their inclusion in the communities that host them, and also in national systems and development plans. So it also calls for constructive cooperation to be established between humanitarian and development actors. And finally, the third main feature that I would highlight is that the compact places considerable emphasis on national ownership and leadership in planning and implementing refugee responses. The adoption of the compact will, I think, not mark the end of the process, but rather the beginning of collective efforts to realize its potential. I say that, first of all, because there are elements in the text that will require further elaboration. How to organize a global refugee forum is one example, but there are others, like defining ways to strengthen national systems such as health and education systems to include refugees in those. Let's also remember that the compact is already being implemented through the CRF. Over the past 2 years, new political will and partnerships have been mobilized in many countries, geared towards improving refugee lives. There are, of course, many challenges remaining, but we can build on positive momentum. In this perspective, I think that partnerships will be at the center of the compact's implementation, bringing the multiplier effect required to expand our collective capacity to respond. The compact is truly meant to develop multi-stakeholder approaches, also actually with the participation of refugees themselves, and that is something very important. So finally, in evaluating the impact of the compact that the compact can have on Canada and actually on us all, I think it is important to analyze the risks associated with the current deficiencies of the refugee regime. Failing refugees can only lead to radicalization and lost generations, and this is in nobody's interest. We can also say that there are high expectations from host states, and so we need the compact and other efforts, but the compact to rebuild trust and credibility of the refugee regime. In this perspective, we know that globally Canada is regarded as a leader in refugee policy. Canada is recognized for its major contributions in terms of resettlement and complementary pathways. It is also a champion of refugee education and on the protection and empowerment of women and girls. We are all grateful for this and will be delighted to see more. Given the dire needs, we do hope that Canada will be a strong contributor to the Global Refugee Forum through commitments, but also, I have to say, through showcasing good practices, because contributions will not necessarily mean higher funding levels or resettlement places, although that would be, of course, great. It will also mean continuing to lead by example, sharing your experience and expertise, and using your good offices and governing power. To take a concrete example, your Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative aims to help other countries to open new pathways for refugee protection. Well, this is exactly the spirit of the compact.
I need you to wind up very quickly, please.
Okay, I am concluding now. In conclusion, NGOs have occasionally questioned some elements of the compact, for example, the lack of considerations for internationally displaced persons. But overall, we see this as a major achievement that can help reshape refugee responses. This will not happen overnight. It will require political will and engagement for all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Axworthy now. You might want to enroll in our frequent witness loyalty program. We give points, and it's very good to have you back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of the World Refugee Council, and to begin by simply saying I think we, as a council, strongly endorse the importance of the compact and certainly underline that it is a very critical piece of architecture to be able to begin mobilizing support, accountability, direct participation, and certainly financing, all of which are really crucial sort of elements of a functioning refugee system. I think even perhaps in the broadest sense, it's really the compact does represent a continued commitment to find international, multilateral, collaborative, cooperative solutions, as opposed to the kind of distemper that's affecting so much of our world these times, which is to go it alone, simply to revert back to a form of 19th century nationalisms in which everybody can solve their own problems. That's simply, as we know, impossible when you're dealing with a global-wide phenomenon. Now, at the latest count, is 26, 27 million refugees with almost an equal number of internally displaced persons, which, by the way, is something that is very essential to be incorporated in any reform process. The fact that there are millions of stateless people who have been denied any kind of anchorage or credibility or legitimacy. So what we're saying is that we support the compact, but we also, as our previous speaker said, it's a beginning. It is by no means sort of it's a framework. It now has to be developed in terms of the working tools that go into place. I guess it's the transition from the architects to the plumbers and the carpenters, who now have to start building or rebuilding a refugee system, which is in really, I think, quite serious straits. Let's begin with one very clear example, which is the financing system. It is totally a voluntary donation system. The compact negotiations were not allowed to include that as part of their negotiations. That was not their mandate. And so as a result, the very important proposals around a comprehensive refugee framework are going to be dependent on still the goodwill and charity of other countries and other donors. And as we know, that's a shrinking constituency. So that one of the things that I think as a council we want to emphasize is that we now have to begin looking at a much more specific set of toolkits. In the financial area, we've really been looking at things of how to apply some of the best practices of trade preferences to provide economic development jointly for people in the host countries and the refugees who join them, to begin looking at capitalization through a form of refugee bond, a sort of a social impact bond. I won't give full disclosure on that. We'll have it in our report. Certainly the whole question of holding accountable the thugs and the dictators and all the people who are causing the conflicts which create the refugees, and that they become the victims of this kind of wanton period when money and greed are so much driving where we want to go. That's one reason why we are very strong in bringing in and having countries endorse the idea of setting up a reallocation of frozen assets so that there is no impunity in terms of being able to protect your ill-begotten treasures when in fact they can be attached through a proper legal process and be returned to help support and help revive the serious gaps in funding that refugee groups now have. We're now reaching a stage where the pledging conferences may be only getting pledges up to 30, 40, 50%, and even those are not being delivered. So that accountability, holding not only countries who are the cause of the conflicts that create the refugees, but also at the other end of the pipeline, people who make pledges and don't live up to them. There's got to be an accountability system. And that's one thing that was very difficult to negotiate through the compact process. Another clear example of that is a leadership system. There is a serious void of women involved in refugee activity, leadership, both at the local community levels as well as through the organizations and intent. There's also, I think, this dichotomy that was established between the international role and the national role. I think there's also a very significant role for regional organizations to have more involvement and more authority to begin undertaking issues. I'll use an example. Our council was in Colombia in just 2 months ago, looking at the surge coming out of Venezuela. Well, right now there isn't a regional answer, even though the impact is the 5,000 people a day who are crossing out of Venezuela are going to Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador and Brazil. So right now, one of the efforts that we've been making is to how to reformulate a regional answer to that, similar to the kind of migrant things we're seeing, issues in the Central America issue, the return of the Rohingya in Asia. As a council, we actually went to the front lines. We were right where the refugee problems were most apparent, met with the people, were able to discuss that. And so I think what we're talking about is a fairly next step, second round of action, really organized through networks of like-minded, committed governments, private sector, NGO, universities. I mean, this is the kind of thing where in past reform initiatives that some of you in the Canadian Parliament will know about that we did in the past, things like the R2P issue and the landmines, you can pull together active networks that can consolidate and combine around very specific targets and accomplish those. And I think our view at the council was that once you begin getting some real, some direct solutions that make a real difference to individual refugee communities or people, then you're going to start rebuilding trust and confidence. You can talk about it and you can ask for it, but you have to win it. You have to earn it. And you earn it by showing the governments can collaborate, can work together, as we did back in the 80s on the boat people when I was the immigration minister in Canada, to actually find solutions. And it's that lack of performance, that lack of being able to manage the system, both at the border level and then the larger level, which I think is really creating the problems. So I would say that I hope that the committee will strongly support the compacts themselves, but also indicate that there is a lot of very specific commitments that will have to be made by governments like our own, by private sector and non-governmental sources to start actually developing very specific initiatives around which we can begin making a real change in the protection and promotion of the refugees.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to go to Mr. MacArthur. Ms. Singh will speak. Thank you.
CARE Canada is honored to contribute to the committee's deliberations today. CARE is a rights-based international NGO. We support life-saving humanitarian assistance, peace building, as well as longer-term development work, with a specific focus on women and girls. Last year, our work reached nearly 60 million people in 95 countries, including refugee-hosting countries such as Jordan, Bangladesh, and Kenya. I will begin by sharing an example of the way we work with refugees and host communities in such contexts. My colleague will then provide our perspectives on the Global Compact on refugees. CARE has been in Jordan since 1949. In recent years, Jordan has absorbed almost 700,000 Syrian refugees, of over 85% who currently live below the poverty line. This has placed significant strain on government services and on the communities where refugees are trying to eke out a new living. So we have set up 4 urban refugee hubs across Jordan. These are essentially community centers like you would find anywhere in Canada, with children singing off key and a flurry of activity. But the urban refugee hubs are innovative in that they provide service and assistance to refugees and vulnerable Jordanians alike, immediate cash assistance, psychosocial support, and skills training. This accomplishes a number of things. First, it helps supplement services provided by the Jordanian government. Second, the hubs relieve pressure on the current humanitarian system by building men and women's capacities to generate income and become self-reliant. Third, the hubs foster social cohesion, providing services that otherwise would not be available to local Jordanian populations. Finally, urban refugee hubs provide a safe space to refugees to speak to other refugees, to share their experiences, and to recover a sense of normalcy and dignity. As you will have seen in Uganda, amazing things happen when we help refugees help themselves. Our most recent annual assessment noted that refugees in Jordan are becoming more self-sufficient and less reliant on aid. In an era of unprecedented humanitarian need, more protracted conflicts, and increasingly scarce resources, solutions like these help us stretch our aid dollars and foster longer-term, more sustainable impact.
And this is why, in 2016, states, NGOs, and multilateral agencies came together to ensure that the complementary implementation of best practices would no longer be left to chance, but rather woven into the fabric of the global refugee system. Because at the end of the day, the global refugee challenge is entirely manageable. Consider that refugees make up just 0.3% of the global population. The problem, as I think you've heard previously, is rather that 88% of the world's refugees are concentrated in a handful of frontline states. These are largely low and middle income countries already grappling with poverty, poor infrastructure, food insecurity, and political instability. These are countries which have, to a great extent, been left to shoulder the responsibility of hosting refugees alone, oftentimes over decades. That is why in the New York Declaration, world leaders expressed their determination to save lives, protect rights, and share responsibility for the highest number of refugees since World War II. CARE was actively involved in the articulation of the New York Declaration, and we have remained engaged through the 2 years of intensive consultations towards the strongest possible global compact on refugees. And I am confident that that is what we have achieved. By no means is the Global Compact on Refugees perfect, but it is a document that recognizes that the global forced displacement challenge is inherently political, that countries of first asylum provide a vast public good, that women and girls experience particular gender-related barriers and bring unique capacities and contributions, that labor policies that support refugees' self-sufficiency help them become a net benefit to host communities, and that more must be done to tackle root causes such as conflict, abuse of human rights and international humanitarian law, exploitation, discrimination, and poverty. So I'm here to tell you today that CARE supports the Global Compact on Refugees, which we believe can help bring about a more predictable, consistent, coherent, and efficient international response to large flows of refugees. What the Global Compact on Refugees lacks is legal teeth or a clear way of holding states and other stakeholders accountable for its implementation. Paragraph 4 of the Compact states that it will be operationalized through voluntary contributions to achieve collective outcomes and progress towards its objectives, end quote. This is where the world needs more Canada. CARE recommends 2 key ways in which Canada can help the Global Compact for Refugees set new standard in the way the world responds to refugee crisis. First, Canada should offer to co-host the first Global Refugee Forum. The Global Refugee Forum is established under the GCR, represents a critical opportunity to calibrate progress, share best practices, and pledge contributions towards the objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. Canada is regarded as an honest broker and is uniquely positioned amongst countries to help co-host the first Global Refugee Forum. Second, Canada should support a comprehensive, gender-responsive response to a specific large-scale or protracted refugee situation. This would be done in partnership with a refugee hosting country and in collaboration with UNHCR and local civil society organizations. It should involve the activation of the support platform conceived in the Global Compact for Refugees, including efforts to galvanize political commitment, mobilize financial, material, and technical assistance, facilitate coherence between humanitarian and development responses, and support policy initiatives that can help ease pressure on host countries, build resilience and self-reliance, and find solutions. The Global Compact on Refugees offers a blueprint for a more consistent, predictable, and efficient global refugee response system, a system capable of restoring trust and cooperation between countries. CARE firmly believes that the Compact's operationalization and our ability as an international community to report on its progress in the coming years is a key migration opportunity for Canada in the 21st century. And with that, we look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Mr. Sarai, for 7 minutes.
I want to thank you all for your great insight. I'll start with Mr. Axworthy, if you can begin. You've been in government and with NGOs for several decades, particularly with respects to foreign affairs and seeing immigration and refugee challenges. What's the primary reasons for the increase in IDPs and large-scale refugees? Is this a pattern that's always been there, or is this more worse in the last decade than it was before?
Well, I think there's always been displaced persons. We made some, however, distinctions, legal distinctions. So the refugee has to be somebody who crosses a border in search of protection against persecution. Internally displaced people are affected by exactly the same conditions: conflicts, starvation, extermination, police brutality, whatever the case may be. But they don't get as far as the border. And that's where we think it's really important that the reform process that the compact will hopefully be a catalyst for will begin to incorporate these questions of internally displaced persons. You'd be interested to know that the first time that I heard the notion of responsibility to protect was when Francis Deng, back in the mid-90s, was the UN Special Representative for Displaced Persons. And he put forward the idea that if countries are not able or willing to protect citizens with their proper rights, then there is an international community responsibility that goes with it. Interestingly enough, we were able to take that concept and sort of fast forward it into something that now has sort of entrenchment in the UN system, if not always being applied. And it simply shows that the problem of displaced people goes back until certainly the thing that the Envoy Deng identified for me when I was in foreign affairs as something that really had to be done. But unfortunately, the way the negotiating process goes around the compact, that issue wasn't really allowed to kind of come in as one of the central agenda points. And that's why we're saying now that we've got a platform which the compact can provide, we now have to build on it and sort of build the more tailored responses to the very specific and concrete issues that are redundant throughout the world, but also very different in their impacts.
Is there a place in the compact for political will to prevent events that cause the large-scale movement of people? When a dispute or famine or issues erupt, to perhaps where the world intervenes earlier to prevent the forced migration in situations.
Unfortunately, the Security Council, which was under the Charter given the prime responsibility for maintaining peace and security, is becoming very dysfunctional because of the great power disputes and the exercise of the veto. As a result, a lot of conflict situations are simply bypassed or subject to kind of a rhetorical flourish of another resolution or a statement of goodwill, but not a concrete action. Let me just give you an indication of a news report that came out this week about the Central African Republic. Now, who reads reports from Central African Republic? Well, some of us do. But it was a story about how one of the armed groups, because there's a civil war going on, there's a UN presence, but the UN security presence is limited. So as a result, one of the warring groups went into the capital city, attacked people in displaced persons camp. Some 20,000 people were under attack with hundreds of fatalities and injuries. Now, why aren't we sort of geared up to respond to that? And it goes back to, I think, what one of the previous interlocutors said. Dealing with refugees is more than a humanitarian issue. It's very much a political issue. It's very much a security issue. And that's where I think we have to kind of broaden the discussion and the examination of what needs to be done to make the objectives, the goals of the compact, to bring them forward for implementation.
And how would you take the fact that some countries have not opted to be in it, particularly one of the larger refugee intakes in past history of the United States? Without them, do you think it's quite weakened, or do you think there's room to have them added in the future if they so will? so wish?
It would always be great to have full unity around these issues, but to get unity of 193 governments, not so easy. As a result, I think what we've learned in the last decade or two, that we can mobilize reform and international action without having, a full court press. We've had initiatives where you've had maybe 8 or 9 countries taking an initiative. They bring in partners from the NGO community. There's partners from the private sector and from the international institutions. So they tackle a disease, an Ebola problem through the WHO. In our case, we did the Landmines Treaty, where it was done outside the circumstance of the UN, but brought back into the UN because there was no way that the negotiating mandates of the UN were going to allow a real solution to that problem. So I think we have to begin to learn how to think away from the hierarchies and the top-down kinds of systems and begin looking at how you develop really a network system for active implementation of very specific solutions. And I guess if I was making a case to you as a committee, and that is provide a ringing endorsement for the compact, and then let's get on with looking at the more specific solutions of which Canada can be a major promoter or interpreter of.
How am I doing for time? My next question would be for Jerome Eli, I think it was, from Switzerland. You mentioned something and I didn't quite get the full gist, and maybe if you can elaborate. You said increased radicalization if refugee regimes are not modernized, if I'm correct, or can you explain that? What would cause increased radicalization in this refugee process? I want to hear that from you.
Well, that's linked to the...
I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to have you answer the question. Sorry about that. Ms. Rempel.
Mr. Axworthy, could you tell us if the World Refugee Council provides any programming services for refugees?
We provide a number of interesting sort of things that have grown out of our existence. One example is Eduardo Stein, who's the former vice president of Guatemala, was just appointed the UN envoy for Venezuela based upon an inquiry that we did into Venezuela, Colombia just 2 months ago. At the same time, what we're doing is we're working very actively now with refugee organizations to determine how they become involved in actually
You know how
making
this
the
works,
decision.
though, right? Like, you've been in these chairs, so you know don't have a lot of time. But I mean, does the World Refugee Council actually provide any services for refugees? So no practical reintegration services or language training or aid?
No, we're not a service organization. I think there's those. What we are trying to do, however, is take a step behind that, which is to begin looking at the way we can develop serious financing for those programs.
Okay. Can I ask how much the government of Canada provides in annual funding to your organization?
I don't think it's an annual fee. It was a one-time funding of, I think it was about $800,000. That was accompanied by about 3 or 4 times that from American foundations, as well as from our own think tanks. So it's been a composite contribution that comes from a number of sources.
And that's ongoing, or you are self-sufficient?
No, I don't think the council sees itself as a permanent organization. We were brought together for the specific purpose of trying to provide an independent source of ideas and proposals and recommendations around the contract process so we can actually get down to serious work.
Okay. You, I think, have said that the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States should be abolished. Is that correct?
The third-party agreement? Yeah, I think that right now it's getting in the way of our being able to solve some of the problems at the borders. I'm going down on Monday.
So I'm going to ask another question on that. So do you think that the UNHCR should continue to refer refugees to the United States?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think...
Okay, I have a question. How do you square that circle? So if the United States is no longer a safe third country and we should suspend the agreement, then why should the UNHCR refer refugees to it?
Well, the United States is still accepting applications much reduced. I think they've reduced by almost 80%.
So, but
They've got-
I guess what I'm trying to say is it's kind of either a safe third country or it's not. So if it's
No,
not
no,
a safe third country in relation to people coming from upstate New York into Canada, then why should the United States be asked to accept refugees from the UNHCR anymore?
You have to go back, I think, to its origins, which it came out really as part of the follow-up package to the 9/11 border arrangements, that we wanted to provide a kind of cooperative management of the system. It's changed. I think the present administration has a very different view of what is a refugee or what the responsibility of the United States
So
is.
refugees
And as a
aren't
result,
safe
it makes it more
under
difficult.
Trump? So I just
It
want to
makes-
know, are refugees safe under Donald Trump?
I think that they are, it depends safe from what. I don't think they're going to be, but they are being incarcerated. Their kids are being taken away. I mean, there's a number of very serious default lines in U.S.
So
policy.
are you
at the
also going
present
to, is the World Refugee Council, which doesn't provide services to refugees, are you also going to ask the UNHCR to stop referring refugees to the United States?
No, I think that what we're suggesting is that we,
But I just
one of
don't
the,
get that. I don't get that, Mr. Axworthy. I mean,
Well-
how can you say that the United States is not a safe
Well-
third country for people that are in upstate New York already and they should come to Canada, yet the UNHCR should refer them to United States? I mean, like, they're either safe under Trump or they're not.
the UNHCR is simply implementing
Really?
the 1951 Refugee Convention. And if there's refugees applying for asylum or sanctuary, it's a
So
responsibility.
they are safe under Trump.
They may or may not.
UNHCR refugees are safe under Trump, but people
Well-
in upstate New York are not safe under Trump.
I would say that, again, it's not one of those black and white either or. It's increasingly.
I would argue it is. I would say it's
Well,
either the
maybe,
U.S.
well,
asylum system is working and it's safe for refugees.
No, it's not. I mean, it has been substantially reduced. And one
So
of the things
who would be safe under Trump? So UNHCR refugees are safe, but not
better
upstate
check.
New York refugees.
You better check with them. I'm not.
But you
in
no,
any
but
way
you
providing
are
the
very
guidance on that
respected,
policy.
sir, and you've made this big pronouncement on Canadian policy, and your organization is not funded to provide refugee services, but to provide think tank support. And now you're saying you're not sure who is
Well,
safe in
more
the
than
U.S.
think-
and who isn't. So isn't that a little weird? Like,
No,
don't
I
you
think
think?
that-
Don't you think that's strange?
What I'm saying is that we're going through a real time of distemper, where not just the United States, but other countries
But don't
are
you think
substantially
it's
shrinking.
irresponsible to say that the United States is no longer a safe third country if you can't?
I didn't say it was, I said that I think that it doesn't share the same definition
did.
or
You said
acceptance of refugees.
you should suspend the
Well,
agreement.
you know, that's part of the problem
kinda
is that there's
weird.
now such a wide variance. You can go into European countries where the definition of refugees is much broader than you will find
So,
in Canada.
okay, so to be
what you'll find-
clear-
and certainly the United States has taken it down to a very narrow window by which they will accept
So
asylum
refugee is from
applications.
upstate New York, but
No, they're
not
not
from
from
a
there.
UN camp. Because it's cool to refer UNHCR camp refugees to the United States under Trump, but
No,
not
let's
upstate
come
New
back-
York. So for Canada's purposes, upstate New York is a refugee, but Yazidi genocide survivor?
Let's go back to the way the system should work, which is that one of the problems with the third-party system is that you can't make application through the official residences or embassies of Canada. You have to cross a border because under the third-party system, you're prevented from going to a Canadian
Do
consulate.
you really
to make
think
a-
that somebody should be claiming asylum in Canada after reaching the United States? Because, I mean, that's really at the
Why
core
not?
of it. Like, I don't accept the academic argument of where you're making
I'm afraid
it.
I need to end you there.
Thank you.
Ms. Kwan?
Mr. Chair, and you know, I actually like to pick up on that, Mr. Axworthy. I particularly actually appreciate the work that you do, and especially in this capacity, even though you were the former minister for the Liberal Party and I'm NDP. But that said, I appreciate the work that you do because this is not a partisan issue. When we're talking about a humanitarian crisis, when we're talking about lives, and it's not a show either. It's not about tricking people into a perspective. And I do want to touch on the Safe Third Country Agreement because it's so easy to simply say, oh, gee, but the United States is a safe country because the UN refers people to that country at the moment. But we're trying to neglect and ignore the fact that the United States currently, as you were mentioning, Mr. Axworthy, that they rip children away from parents. We're currently ignoring the fact that the United States is declaring transgender people, people from the LGBTQ community, to be stripped of their identity, as though somehow that is a safe thing for people to be there who's seeking asylum. It's so easy to be clean and cut and black and white on that. On reality, though, where it impacts people's lives, maybe not so much. So on that question, I do appreciate your comments that you have made, Mr. Axworthy, that that Canada needs to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement because of those actions of the United States. So with that being said, to the Global Compact issue, you mentioned a variety of things to which Canada can take action on. And I am particularly interested from your thoughts, though you're a think tank, and so maybe we can get your thoughts with your experience of having been a cabinet minister, the actual actions that you think Canada should take that would actually contribute to this global crisis that we're all faced with as human beings in this globe.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your words. And could I make one comment? I think one of the important, I hope, outcomes of this discussion is that parliamentarians will take a much more active role. This is something that shouldn't be subject to kind of partisan divisions. This is something that really affects people's lives in the most severe and direct way. And the degree to which, so as a committee and others, you can promote the ability of Canada to offer that kind of broader-based initiatives. And where they happen, I think we really start with this fundamental question of accountability. International organizations, people who work in the community have to be held to some form of judgment, assessment of their actions. And that's one reason why we have been working with a number of governments around the idea of being able to attach frozen assets that have come out because of sanctions or the Magnitsky Act and reallocate them back to help people who are the victims who have suffered from the actions of these bad guys. And the Swiss have already passed legislation to that effect. There's other countries looking at it. We hope Canada will look at it, because that's a way not only of putting money back in the system, it also means that if you are one of the warlords or despots, you're not going to be so anxious to provide money in your piggy bank somewhere in the world if you know that it's going to be attached by good forensic work done by our courts and our banks. So I think there's a very specific thing that has a double whammy: more money for the system, and also way of putting a real deterrent on the actions of people right now who are so much the cause of the refugee movements.
So your recommendations for Canada to put in a bill, a legislation similar to that of Switzerland with regards to the frozen assets?
Glad. I think our team would be very glad to provide you with some models of that.
Okay, is that something that you can send to the committee for our
Yes.
review? That would be excellent if you could
For
do
sure,
that.
we'll do that for sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to turn to our witnesses that are here at this table. And with regard to Canada's role, the Conservatives suggested, for example, that Canada should not be part of the Global Compact. And I wonder whether or not you can comment on that and what you think the fallout might be if we were to undertake that perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a good one. I mean, I think that what it comes down to is Canada wields some moral authority. I think we said it in our remarks that Canada is regarded as an honest broker. Canada, along with Canadian civil society, along with groups resettling, private sponsors resettling refugees, have been engaging very heavily through this process. And I think that we've arrived at something that we now need to take forward. And it takes the willing. It takes good political will. This is an encapsulation and a codification of political will and good practice. And now what we need to do is we need to see it actually implemented. We don't want it to become a paper tiger. And the good news there is that Canada has already put in place a lot of systems and mechanisms that lend themselves towards the type of comprehensive refugee response envisioned in the Global Compact on Refugees. So hence my point that the world needs more Canada. Were Canada to step back at this point, I think that it would turn a lot of heads and it would be a severe disappointment for a lot of Canadians, as well as for a lot of refugees, as well as for that fundamental trust that this whole effort seeks to build between refugee hosting states and countries like Canada.
I don't have very much time left, so I'm just going to ask very quickly, 1 minute, on this question. There are folks who like to spread misinformation. For example, they call asylum seekers illegals and therefore denigrating them and then create the impression somehow in the hearts and minds of Canadians that they're violating the law when in fact they're not under the Immigration Refugee Protection Act. In the face of that, what is your advice to us in trying to cope with that situation and to correct the record?
Well, I think that the deliberations that the committee is having here today is important. I think that we need community leaders, parliamentarians to speak up. Next week, we'll see further resettlement of private sponsors. There are thousands of Canadians that are working hard to contribute their best to the reform of the global refugee system. And it's my daily bread and butter as a policy and advocacy guy, trying to tell those good stories. I think the Global Compact on Refugees provides a hook for that. We talked about the Global Forum. This is an opportunity for the international community, countries like Canada, whose values are aligned with these types of responses, to celebrate progress in a couple of years. And I certainly hope that Canada would be part of that. But yes, we have myth busting to do, and as civil society, we're doing our darndest, and look forward to talking to any of you who want to work with us on that.
Thank you. Mr. Tavara, just for a couple of minutes.
Mr. Chair, and I'll be very quick. Mr. Axworthy, my question will be for you. The World Bank estimates that the pool of cash to be 10 billion to 20 billion per year of frozen assets. I wanted to ask you, and I know you're working closely aligned with CG in my region in KW. I wanted to ask you how that would be implemented. If you can give us kind of an example of how that would be implemented, very short.
I think there's different models, but the short form is that we would use our domestic court system, say the federal court system, to be the adjudicator, and that claims can be made against a frozen asset where the donor of that is a crook, is corrupt, is a warlord, has been responsible for massacres or genocides, and that we simply make application. And the discussions we've had with financial institutions, they would be happy for that because they live in fear that some cousin of some dictator or some warlord is going to come along and ask for the money. So I think this is a kind of a way of providing new invention, and I would hope that the NGO community, just their spokesman before, would begin looking at some of the innovative ideas, not just what is, but what could be, to provide, again, a different toolbox or a different set of levers that we can use to bring about sort of real change that will have a direct impact on refugees themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Axworthy, and thank you for your years of service.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I think we're going to bring this panel to an end. We have a brief business meeting we want to accomplish. So thank you again to, especially to Mr. Eli for being up so late. So thank you for that. And we're going to just suspend for 1 minute and then come back for a brief business meeting.